Hi, everyone. I'm Julie Meyer, and I'm very happy that you're here. I'm going to go back a couple slides because I see I'm on slide 4 for some reason. And I am the project coordinator of California Deafblind Services. And you're here because you're interested in thinking about children with Charge syndrome, young adults with Charge syndrome, and also autism, and the fact that it seems to come up often that children with Charge may also have a dual diagnosis of autism. So I was really pleased when Donna and Jennifer invited me to speak today. I'm going to start out the presentation with letting you know that this presentation was kind of a brainchild of an article that I wrote with the former project coordinator of California Deafblind Services, Maurice Belote, who many of you may know. He's the man here on the left in this photograph. And that's us at the most recent Charge conference where we did this presentation. And I'm doing it with his blessings. You're learning just from me. And the whole presentation I've done several different times. And it's based on an article that Maurice and I wrote, and I'll tell you more about that in a second. And then the other gentleman on the right, if you're here because you're a member of the Charge world, you know, that's David Brown. And he is a person who really kind of, Maurice and I had talked about this a lot with this idea of both Charge and autism, or a dual diagnosis, or what we should do about that. So so I want to thank them for kind of being my the people that I could bounce ideas off of, and also an inspiration for this presentation. And then, but the real inspiration is this little cutie down here in the bottom picture. There's a photograph, and there's a small child. I think she was probably 4 here, and maybe 5. And her name's Jet, and she lives in California, and she has Charge syndrome. And David Brown was the first technical assistance provider that provided assistance to the family when she was just a baby. And then I started providing technical assistance to her later. And so that's the first time David had seen her in several years when he saw her at this conference. That was at the 2017 conference. Charge conference. So anyways, Jet was a big inspiration, and you're going to hear more about why and her story in a little bit. And so to kind of set the stage for what will happen today, because I know some people like to know what's planned ahead, we're going to spend the first part of the session talking about what autism is, what the profile for a learner who has Charge syndrome is, and then do a little fun activity. And then I'll take questions throughout. So at different portions of the presentation, we'll break for questions. And then we're going to look at evidence-based practices for both autism and for deafblindness, and consider that, and consider the idea of the dual diagnosis. And then we are going to move into talking about educational practices and behavioral interventions. So what I want to preface here, and this is really important, so listen up. I am an educator. I'm a teacher. I'm not a psychologist. I'm not a neurologist. I'm not a doctor. So I am not someone who's qualified to give a medical diagnosis of autism or a medical diagnosis of Charge syndrome. So I'm an educator who has had a lot of experience working with children with Charge syndrome and young adults through my work with the Deafblind Project. I've also, when I was a teacher many, many years ago, I had the opportunity to work with a lot of learners who had autism. So I'm someone that has experience teaching children with either Charge syndrome or autism. And I have thoughts and ideas about this idea of Charge and autism, or Charge or autism. So that's what I want you to just recognize, that that's what this is. This is not me presenting a research project. This is not me being a psychologist or a physician. I'm just telling you some things that I think will be helpful if you're considering the idea of two different diagnoses or labels and what interventions I think educational teams should be looking for. Okay, so I hope that disclaimer is clear. um, I want to start off with this, and I got to give credit once again to my colleague Maurice, because he's the one that kind of brought this up brilliantly, I thought, in a presentation that I saw him talk about charge syndrome, is thinking about identification detours and how oftentimes people that may not be familiar with charge syndrome or have met anyone with charge syndrome before, when they meet a child with charge syndrome or a young adult, what they may see instead are features that either they see physically in the person or in how they behave, how they communicate, how they interact, and they may make assumptions about a label for that person or identifying that person. So examples would be if someone had never met a young man with charge syndrome, like the boy here, he's a teenager here on the top of the page, and he's at a Boy Scout camp, and he has charge syndrome, and but he experiences facial palsy because of it, so he's not really doesn't have a lot of expression. So many times though, when people meet a person who has a language delay or a motor delay with their skills or lack of facial expression, they may think that person has autism or that person has an intellectual disability without really understanding the other reasons why those things might be present. And then below that, there's a young child with charge syndrome who's lying on a tabletop and looking at a musical instrument. It's bells that go around in a circle. And he was really interested in playing with it from underneath. And it could have been because it was more interesting to him that way. It could have been that it was giving him more stability, more vestibular input that was helping him to be able to use his vision functionally. But anyways, when we see children who have language delays and are not making eye contact and have stereotypic behaviors or features that they do that seem kind of obsessive or perseverative, oftentimes people right away think autism. So again, but those are features sometimes we see with charge. So just being aware of sometimes people think things because they don't know other things. So the seed for this presentation and for thinking about this is in 2014, Maurice and I wrote an article for our newsletter that comes out twice a year about why deafblindness and autism can look so much alike. And that came up because we were getting more and more inquiries from families and from service providers or reading posts, especially on the charge syndrome page, about how similar autism and charge looked, or deafblindness and autism looked, and was it possible to have both? And so we wrote an article, and what this article does is we really just kind of talked about why features that you might see in autism could be explained if you thought about someone having both a vision and hearing loss or difficulties there. So the article can be found on our website. And so I'm not going to go too much further than that, but we decided to share our thoughts about it. So feel free to check it out and to share it. I'm going to say to anybody right now, though, that's going to try to quickly go find the link and put it up. The link does not work because something happened to our website about 3 weeks ago where our links got, we have to update them with a different code. So our administrative specialist is slowly working on it, but he hasn't gotten to 2014 yet. So, but it will be available soon. Okay, this slide is just to help us remember that oftentimes we judge people that are really, I think, are very, I say, the dog is barking a lot. Maybe they muted themselves. Okay. Well, this slide just reminds us that all of us have habits and routines. It's just that many times I think that we see people who have autism or people that may have charge syndrome or people who are deaf blind that have habits and routines that they do that are not expected or seem unusual to us. So all of a sudden we think that's a problem and we want to kind of fix that. But this is an image of going into a grocery store and thinking about the fact, and I challenge all of you to think about it. When you go to the grocery store, do you always enter, get your cart, and like go to the same section first? Do you start in a certain way and kind of follow it? I know I do. When I go to my local Trader Joe's, I always kind of go through the produce area the same way. Then I go and get my eggs and milk. Then I go down the frozen food aisle. Then I go to the dried nuts and fruits and things. So, and stores are set up this way because they know that these are the habits that people have. So, this is just to remind us, because I think when people think about autism and charge, one of the reasons they see them so linked is because how they're watching the behaviors of the person. And if we think about why an individual, either with autism or charge syndrome, might have certain routines or might have certain habits, there are really probably very good reasons for it. And so it's not really our place as people who are neurotypical or who have efficient sensory systems to be judging them on doing something that's helping them to get by in the world and to so that the world seems more understandable. Okay, this slide to me is really important, and it's more my perspective about things, so you don't have to agree with all of it. But this is, if you stick with me for the rest of the day, for the rest of the session, you're going to keep hearing me come back to this. I think that I'm going to admit that children, individuals with charge syndrome or who have autism, are really puzzling. And it can be really hard to develop the right program for them or to have the right supports for them at home. And I know it can be frustrating for families and care providers and educators. But I also think that thing that's puzzling and kind of how we have to stretch our imagination and creativity, I think that's a really good thing. I actually think it makes us better educators. I can't speak about it as a parent, but I would think that would also do the same. But I'm going to leave that to a parent of a child with charge or autism to say. A diagnosis and a label can be helpful guidance, but it should never be used to define a child. The child is so much more than just the label that they have. I think we have to keep remembering that empathy and perspective taking is really essential. So going back to what I just said about their routines and their habits, really thinking about why might they be doing that. So a good question to always be asking is, how does the world right now appear or feel to that individual? That is, their sensory system is giving them different information that I'm receiving, or their sensory processing, as in autism, is works differently. And I want to just share a personal comment that David Brown shared with me at one point. I asked him before I went to a class, what do you think is the role of the teacher? I was trying to inspire the teachers in a course I was teaching at San Francisco State, which is where our project is located, and I have the opportunity to teach in some of the teacher credential programs. So I was having the students kind of talk about what they thought the role of the teacher was. And so before I went over that day to my class, David said, the role of the teacher should be to help the child become who they already are, rather than changing the child into someone who society thinks they ought to be. So we need to discover who the child is inside and then support the child on their journey to becoming who they truly are. So I really, really liked that and thought I'd share that. The other person who reminds us about the importance of empathy and perspective taking is Jan van Dyke. And I know that the Maryland Project, I believe in the past has even had him come and do trainings. And so many of you may know who he is. He was He's an educator, sadly, who passed away a few years ago, but who is from the Netherlands. And he's really the person that has inspired a lot of us in terms of our approach to assessment and instruction of individuals with multiple disabilities, including deafblindness. And he says that the multisensory impaired person is a unique human being with a unique line of development who's more dependent on the professional's willingness to accept this and act accordingly than any other group of disabled persons. So he wrote that in 2001. So that's Jan van Dyke's perspective and his opinion, but I agree with it completely. I think we really have to be really respectful and understanding that the developmental progression that you're going to see with individuals who are deaf blind or have charge syndrome or have processing differences like that we see with autism, that they're going to be different than typical development. And we have to accept that and then not expect when we assess them and support them and provide intervention that they're going to go on that same developmental trajectory. It's going to be different. So we really, really need to be respectful and empathetic about that. This is my perspective about individuals with charge syndrome. This is what I have found in my experience interacting with them through the technical assistance I provided and working with their families and school teams. They are curious, intelligent, they're resilient, they're quite adaptive and creative, they're persistent, they're mischievous, which is one of the reasons I love them. They're very socially interested in things and mighty particular about order and routine. Okay, so that, and then on this slide, you see some images of different individuals with charge syndrome. One girl's exploring with some water beads with her mother. Another is interacting with a service dog at his school with a teacher providing support. And then there's a young man who's at the deafblind program at Perkins School for the Blind. And it looks like he's making cookies or something. But all right. So now we're going to head into talking about the uh, diagnoses or the definitions of each, both autism and charge. So on this slide, just the autism spectrum disorder. This is from the Autism Society. There's a lot of different ways to explain autism, but this is the one that I like because it really talks about the spectrum that you see with these individuals, as well as how complex it is to really understand. Autism is also a lifelong neurodevelopmental disability, so it's not something that individuals outgrow, and it is brain-based. It affects how they learn, how they process sensory information, how they communicate. Typically, you will see it appearing in early childhood. That's a big part of the diagnosis. And it affects social skills, communication, self-regulation, relationships. And there's a real wide spectrum, so it affects people differently to varying degrees. Maurice and I decided in the article that we wrote to think about the key diagnostic features of ASD, and I'll talk about that. I see there's an interpreter switch. Okay, I'll talk about that in a moment, but so these are the areas, if you look at the DSM-5, that they talk about key features. And it's areas in communication and social interaction delays, having restricted areas of interest, engaging in stereotypical behaviors or movements, resistance to changes in the environment or activities, unusual responses to sensory experiences, and difficulty with executive functioning. And so I ask you, does this look and sound familiar? If you're a parent out there with a child with charge syndrome, or you're an educator with a child with charge syndrome, many of those features probably sound familiar to you. All right. So here's the DSM-5 diagnostic criteria, and I'm not going to spend too long on this because I think a lot of you may know it, but it was updated in 2013, 2014, and there's a couple big changes. One is that a syndrome called Asperger's syndrome became part of the spectrum of autism, and I don't like to use this term, but people kind of thought of Asperger's as, they would say, high functioning autism, and I don't ever use those words, functioning, like that, but it's people that typically had spoken language and would maybe be in general education settings but had difficulty in social situations. So the other change was that they broke up the diagnostic criteria into these two areas, and the individuals who have autism need to meet the three criteria in the top under the primary, which are all related to social emotional reciprocity and communication. Okay, so it's all kind of the social piece. And then the secondary criteria, there should be two of those at least that are met. And that has more to do with the movements and the way they're using speech, that insistence on routines, so that inflexibility that you might see, the highly restrictive interests, and then the responses to sensory aspects of the environment. That piece of either being heightened or reduced reaction to sensory input wasn't in the former criteria. So I actually think that was a good thing to add, personally. But what you need to know is that you have to meet all three of these top three and then a couple of the bottoms. So this is the where I think it's important to think about deaf blindness and charge syndrome is, do they meet these criteria before there's that additional diagnosis of autism? Additionally, this is added to the DSM-5 that the symptoms should be present in early developmental period. It used to be you'd see it before the age of 3, but that was updated and changed because some individuals who who develop language in a typical way at the time that they should. But then there are issues maybe more with the social skills and the social reciprocity. That might not show up until they need to demonstrate that, which often would be school. So it might not show up till they're 4 or 5. So in that case, they so now it's early childhood, so early developmental period. And then the other thing is the impairment needs to be significant enough that it's really affecting them in terms of their social, occupational, or other areas of functioning. So, and there's levels of supports that they kind of break it down into. Um, and then the final thing that's highlighted for you is that these disturbances, and again, this is because this is a diagnostic medical manual, why they're calling it disturbances, are better explained by an intellectual disability or global developmental delay. So if they could be explained in that way, then it shouldn't be autism. Okay, so that would be a rule out. So that's something to keep in mind when we again think about dual diagnosis. So now we're to this question of the chicken or the egg. So this is not recent or new that researchers have seen that there have been autistic behaviors in congenitally deafblind children. So children who are born deafblind, not acquire it later. And what researchers have continued to think about, and I'm going to highlight two in a second, it's necessary to think about if the barriers that are caused by congenital deafblindness, so the barriers caused by having limited or missing vision and hearing, would show up in terms of how they communicate, what their language and social skill development is like, what the sensory isolation that they would experience. What do all of those things contribute to the development of those autistic-like behaviors? So not autism and deafblindness, but seeing autistic-like behaviors because the person has deafblindness. So what's interesting, and David, many of you might have heard him say this, I've heard him say it so many times. Why, when we see a behavior, are we calling it autistic rather than saying that's a deaf-blind behavior? That's a charge-related behavior. For someone who knows charge better than autism, that's what they might think. So, chicken or the egg? Something else that's interesting to consider, I think, is there's unusual visual and auditory characteristics that you see with autism. Now, these are not from the medical diagnosis manual, the DSM-5. This is just for me knowing individuals with autism, and if you go and read things about autism. Visually, many times a key feature of autism is that there's little or difficulty with making eye contact. They often don't follow other people's movements in the environment or try to visually imitate something they see. It's difficult. You may not see them mimicking or reacting to facial expressions, so having not the response that other people have by reading people's facial expressions. You see a lot of kids do this peripheral eye viewing, like they're kind of looking out of the corner of their eye, which could look very much like a child who has field loss or has some kind of cerebral visual impairment. And often they like to isolate on certain visual things. So they really like to look at lights or watch things spin. All of these things sound similar to what I've seen with children who are deafblind or have charge as well. Auditorily, you often hear people say, well, they appear deaf, and it's actually something they rule out at first to make sure the child doesn't have a hearing loss. They don't respond to their name or spoken language that other people use, or respond to loud noises. They may not meet those early milestones for language, and you won't see them visually or physically using means to communicate. Okay, so all of these are things that I'm just describing that you see in autism. And we can go back to that same question that David asked, why are we saying that's autistic and not deaf-blind? Because if a child has both vision and hearing loss, you might see these behaviors, okay? So the focus on autism. So Dan Meyer did research, and what he found, and I think this is really fascinating, that there's 3 areas in terms of behavior where we see similarities between autism and deafblindness. And they're reportedly in terms of what we see with social interaction, what we see with communication, and then restrictive and repetitive behaviors. Now, what I think is important to keep in mind here with charge syndrome is that because we're looking at how they're socially interacting, communicating, or behaviors that we're seeing them or hearing them engage in, this is indicating that the suspicion or diagnosis of autism is based on our observations of the person's behavior rather than considering internal and external factors that might be affecting that person. And we know with charge syndrome that there's a lot of internal factors in terms of issues with their vestibular and their proprioceptive senses, in terms of medications that they may be taking, in terms of health related issues that have to do with a myriad of things, from swallowing and eating to all types of other things that have to do with their GI system, um, and then just trying to regulate in terms of their sensory system. So I think with people looking at those types of behaviors, they're discounting what also might be internal features that have to do with charge syndrome and aren't really related to autism. Dr. Tim Hartshorn developed a charge behavioral profile that many people are familiar with. Those things are just listed here. And I think these are other things for people that don't know charge syndrome well, or if you're a parent out there and you're working with a school team that doesn't, it's important that they understand that these are all things that are part of charge syndrome. I was in a meeting today with a team out here for a young woman who has charge syndrome. And it was so interesting. They told me that she had charge syndrome and autism as well. And I didn't say anything like, oh, how do you know? But the example they gave me for why she had autism, they said, is she's obsessed with her calendar and her watch. She's continually wanting to go back and reference her calendar and look at her watch and talk to people about her watch. And that point is when I had to say, well, actually, that sounds a lot like charge syndrome to me. I know a lot of people with charge syndrome that really, really need to keep referencing back to uh, that structure, a routine, or they may be looking at time or looking at their calendar is their way of connecting with you and saying, I want to tell you about something. So I think it's important to really think about the things that we think are autism. If we don't know charge well enough, they may be charge. So on this slide, you see all of these things that have to do with charge syndrome. And a key one that I want to point out is this social interest. So this real social interest in things, even though sometimes it might be immature. And then in terms of the repetitive behaviors that we see with individuals with charge, oftentimes it increases when they're under stress or where they're in situations that they may feel less secure or more anxious. So just good to know when you compare these things to those key features of autism. Tim Hartshorn and colleagues also, they did a research study, and this is really interesting, this one I think as well. They looked at these three areas, language and social engagement, sensory related movements, and then coping with stressful demands from the environment. So the top two, the language and social engagement and the sensory related movements, that's straight from taking something from the DSM-5 for autism. So what it shows, and the picture that is beginning, and this was back in 2005, so quite some time ago, the picture that's emerging of children with charge is that they're generally socially more engaged and have better language or communication skills than people with autism. However, they engage in more sensory related movements or behaviors, those things that may look like autistic behaviors, more than other people who are deaf blind. So there is a real feature in charge syndrome for a need for these sensory related movements and behaviors. And then coping with stressful demands from the environment, their responses are similar to individuals with autism. So, and that might, you may see them, being more attentive in terms of inanimate objects or withdrawing, or maybe even losing some kind of control and, having a tantrum or something like that. So interesting to see that sometimes they're better at something than an individual with autism. Sometimes they're about the same, and then other times it's different from individuals, others with who are deafblind. So now, and we're about to take a chat break in a second. When we get to this and we look at the DSM-5 again, remember that they need to meet the top three items and the bottom three, at least two of the secondary criteria. Look what happens here. We do see stereotyped and repetitive movements and objects when we think about charge syndrome. We see that inflexibility sometime or adherence to routines. Definitely some restricted fixated interests and a lot of different reactions to sensory inputs. But what you don't often see always with charge syndrome, not to say that you don't ever, but you don't as much, see these same deficits in the social emotional connections and using nonverbal communicative behaviors or maintaining relationships. A lot of these kids are very socially interested and curious and are craving and striving to develop relationships with their peers and other people. Okay, so that this is something else I just think is important to keep in mind. And the other thing to keep in mind is that all of us fall somewhere on the spectrum. So go back and remember what I said about the graphic with the shopping and going through the store in the same way. All of us do all of these things and have different reactions to all of these things in different ways. It's just that many of us, the ways that we decide to socially interact and communicate, or the things that we're interested in, or the stereotype movements we might use, like if you're someone that twirls your hair or flicks the top of your pen, things like that. Those are just things that for some reason the world has decided are socially acceptable. So again, Maurice and I talk more about this in that article that we wrote, really thinking about, and this is a time to be more reflective when we're trying to better understand individuals, realize that we're all somewhere on here. All of us respond differently under stress to all of these different things, okay? So now it's time for a pop quiz. While I've been speaking for the last half hour, how many of you have been swinging your legs or uncrossing and crossing your legs during this presentation? Or maybe you've been biting your nails or twisting your hair or rocking back and forth or fiddling with some jewelry. If you've done any of those things, you're reacting, and I see some people are like giving me their hand up. Maybe they're just raising their hand to the questions. If you are, that's fine. If that is it's because you're reacting to your internal state. You're seeking sensory input. You're trying to stay regulated, keep your arousal levels at just the right place so that you can continue to focus, okay? How many of you cringe or jump at the sound of fireworks or sirens? Or might walk into a restaurant and then walk right back out because you did not like how it smelled? Either the food cooking smells, or maybe it smells too much like cleaning solution or something. I know some people get headaches from the mall, maybe you do. or cut tags out of your clothing before you can wear them. These are all reactions to external input in the environment. So everybody has these reactions. It's just that people with autism and some people with charge have a big reaction or have a reaction to things that we don't think are important. But that doesn't mean that they aren't important. And that doesn't mean that their reaction to them doesn't feel um, appropriate or at the right level. Okay. And then finally, how many of you avoid walking on sidewalk cracks so you won't break your mother's back? Or need to line up your desk just so before you're going to start work in the morning? Or have a certain lucky item that you carry with you most of the time? Or how many of you, when you go to class or go to work, always park in that same place or always sit in the same seat in class? This here are ways that react that are a combination of both external and internal factors. So we do things with our external environment to set up so we can regulate ourselves better internally. These are the things that we do to reduce stress, reduce anxiety. So if you think about your answers to all of these things on the pop quiz, it's easier now to see how we're all somewhere on that spectrum in terms of how we process sensory input and what our outward reactions and behaviors are to those things. So we all, demonstrate different levels of flexibility and adaptability and use of executive function, and we rely on conditions being just right. So, and I think individuals with autism and individuals with charge rely on us to really keep that in mind and go back to what Van Dyke said, like act accordingly if we know that that is something that's important. So I believe we're now at our first chat break, which is exciting. And I'm going to open up the chat and move it over here and see. So let's see. It's being recorded. Thank you, David Brown. Yay. Oh yeah, Ron, Jan. Yes, rest in peace. Amazing. Oh, you were lucky to have dinner with them. Okay. Oh yes. Okay. So thank you, Sharon. They were making their dog treats at Perkins School for the Blind. Maybe also a person who's trying to anticipate what's happening. Okay. Bouncing on my knee. Yes. Play with my hair, bouncing my leg. Yeah. Oh yes. Dave and Buster's, Jennifer. Thank you. Okay. Oh, and hello, Myra. So anybody, any questions at this point? Pop them into that chat. Okay. Seeing none, we're going to move into part 2. All right. And I'm going to move this over. All right. Thanks for hanging in there, guys. Okay. Why does dual diagnosis occur? This is what I think. Okay. This is my personal opinion and my colleague Maurice and I together. So again, not a doctor. This is what the behaviors look familiar. That should have been clear. That's what I was trying to set up with the first part of the presentation. People don't know about deafblindness. They don't know about charge syndrome. Medical professionals, educational professionals, until they get the information, don't know a lot about this. Very low incidence. They might not have had the experience. So we, families and educators that do know these things have to be the ambassadors out there. I see your question, Michelle. I'll answer it in a second. More awareness and experience with individuals with ASD than with deafblindness. So they don't know a lot about deafblindness and charge syndrome, but they know a lot about autism. Autism, and this is great, the increased awareness of autism in the last decade or two is phenomenal. But because everybody recognizes it or has heard about it or seen it in someone that's in a TV show or movie, they think they know autism. And so when they see something that looks like it, they say that's autism versus saying it's charge syndrome because they've never heard of charge syndrome. And also a lot of school systems have invested a lot of training, materials, services that are specific to autism and develop programs that are specific to that. So that could be another reason. And this is an important one. Labels often provide services and supportive resources. So families and service providers seek out it. seek out the diagnosis of autism. And I know many families who have done that, and they couldn't get services when their child just had charge syndrome. Specific services that were going to help their child. They were getting some, but some that they really wanted were only they could only get if they had that autism diagnosis. Um, so I'm going to look at the chat now because there's a few things that popped up. Um, So I have a 6-year-old grandson who just started to hit when getting frustrated. Can you give some interventions to deal with this behavior? Yeah, Michelle, I'm going to talk about that in the third part when we talk about the educational and behavioral interventions. So I'm going to save that for then, if that's okay. And then the quirks that all of us have. Morgan, thank you. We have words like perfectionist and guilty pleasure. It. Oh, I'm going to remember that, Morgan. That's good. Is dual diagnosis bad? Okay, so Cami, that's the question of the day. Not necessarily. What I think you'll see in a second where I think it can go wrong. Okay, so I think I'll answer that as you in the next couple slides. Um, Maurice and I, and this is straight from our article, is that simply put, we think deafblindness and autism may look similar because they significantly impact the way an individual accesses and processes sensory information in their environment. And so that's going to include individuals with charge syndrome for sure. So it took a long time for us to kind of get there. But what we have to really consider and think about is that it has to do with the sensory information that's coming in, how the brain is processing that, and then what the motor reaction is. So, how charge syndrome and autism are similar is that insistence on routines, those repeated stereotypic behaviors, the executive functioning difficulty, and there might be delayed communication and social skills with charge syndrome, and then also meltdowns or tantrums. So these look similar, but what's the key difference to keep in mind is the reasons why they occur. So with ASD, it has to do with sensory processing differences. There's nothing wrong with their vision or their hearing. It has to do with how they are processing information. And it's very different than neurotypical people or people like us, people that do not have autism, people who are not neurodivergent. Literally, they get the same information, but their brain processes it differently. With charge syndrome, it's a multisensory impairment. All the senses are affected. So that has to actually do with the sensory information isn't even getting to the brain fully. They're not getting all the same information. So they're obviously going to do other things to kind of make up for that and adapt for that. Oh, good, Michelle. I'm glad you like that profile. That's Tim Hartshorn's profile. So you should give Dr. Tim Hartshorn credit for that. Okay, so dual diagnosis. So now this is where, Cami, I'm going to talk about the benefits and then some concerns. So here are potential benefits. It may lead to really structured educational environments that will have really predictable routines and transitions, because a lot of educational environments designed for children with autism have those things. The diagnosis can be really helpful to getting helpful, may provide you with helpful and effective intervention and services. So if you're in a small district or a rural area and that's the way you can get services, they're going to help your child develop communication or learn particular social skills, or are going to help you with developing a behavior plan for either school or home, then yes, they can be helpful. Lots of these individualized services and supports focus on communication and social skill development, and they think about sensory processing. So that's good. You may have to give that person that's providing those services and supports more information about sensory deficits or sensory losses in terms of vision and hearing, and also the vestibular sense, but they're already thinking about sensory issues. And also, families often find a lot of valuable social and informational support because they get connected with other children and other families that have similar needs and challenges. So those are all possibly really good things with a dual diagnosis. So here's the concerns that I have. And you're going to hear about one particular one in a while. Students with charge syndrome don't fit in with an autism focused program intervention. So sometimes they're just very strict how the program set up and the kid doesn't fit in. So that's a problem because you're not meeting their individual needs. Oftentimes, intervention approaches might be purely behavioral and aren't going to think about the multisensory issues and the communication needs of a child with charge. So, I'm going to give you a great example in a second, but they may not include using sign language, or they may be highly reliant on visual cues, and that might not be something that works well for a child with charge. The autism diagnosis may carry a lot of weight and become primary, and then it will serve as a barrier to people thinking they need to learn about charge syndrome. Because we know autism, so we don't need to understand charge syndrome. And then additional diagnoses may not provide helpful information. And this additional label then is going to limit a child in terms of what educational opportunities might be offered. Because then you hear people say, like, well, this child has autism and charge syndrome. So now all of a sudden they've got these two things that maybe other general educators or another service provider or someone in the community might think is kind of, well, I don't know about that. That sounds doubly scary to me. So if the label is not going to give additional helpful information or additional good services, then that can be a potential problem. Um, so Cami, I hope that kind of answers your question. And then Mary has a question: how do I delicately talk to parents when I feel their child may have been inaccurately? Okay, let me see if I can answer that in a little bit, Mary. And maybe some of this information will be helpful. And even sharing the article that Maurice and I wrote could be helpful. Um, okay, I'm good. I'm glad that was helpful, Kimmy. Okay, so here's my final thoughts on dual diagnosis: that it's really critical to identify if those autistic characteristics or behaviors could be attributed to the dual sensory or multisensory loss or impairment. Okay, so really think about that. They've got to know about deaf blindness. They have to know about charge syndrome first. If you're doing an assessment for autism, you have to include a person that has knowledge and experience in deafblind education. So if there's not someone on your team that can do that, contact your state deafblind project because they can help you with that. Think about what the additional label is going to offer. Is it going to help you get a better program or better services or more support for the family or for the educators? And then finally, and we're going to get into this next, are evidence-based instructional methodologies and practices that are related to ASD, because there's a lot of research that's validating a lot of different methodologies. Are they the most appropriate one for that child with charge syndrome? Okay. And then, all right, so I think we might be to another chat. So we're to another chat. So I'm going to look at a couple things in the chat and then we'll keep moving on. So Mary, delicately talking to the family when you feel their child might have been inaccurately diagnosed. So one thing is, I guess, just making sure you have a trusted relationship with the family and just have a conversation where you can help to better understand um, why why they feel that additional diagnosis is helpful. Is it answering questions that they had about the child's behavior? Is it helping them better understand maybe delays that the child may have in communication or social skill development? Is it something that maybe someone that they really trusted, say maybe their physician or another service provider, told them would be super helpful? So it might be just kind of finding out what they felt like um, it's offering, and then kind of making sure that they've thought about all these other things that I've spoken of today. And then Jill says, my daughter with charge is in an ASD classroom and oops, a lot of things coming in. And it does not have a diagnosis and it's limited. I'm sorry to hear that, Jillian. That's what I'm seeing with the student I mentioned, that her program's wrong for her. Okay, so that's good. That's the third part. And the ABA method benefits to charge. Okay, Myra, we're going to talk about ABA. Good, great. Okay. My child, here Nicole says, my child with charge had a pre-K teacher that was going to transition to the autism class without a medical diagnosis. Jan Van Dyke just happened to be coming to North Carolina. My son and his school team was invited to join the panel. At the time, he advised a pre-K teacher in his accent and advised that the child does not have autism. Wow. Wow. You got Jan Van Dyke to help you diagnose. That's very, very cool, Nicole. Very cool. Okay, here's my friend Jet. Adorable. She's really into children's theater. She's a very, very imaginative child. And I met her when she was three and a half maybe. And her mother says that I can share this story and this photo, and her name's signed Jet. She she was in a preschool class that was highly structured and set up for individuals with autism. Almost all the kids in the class had autism. Jet and one other boy didn't, and or had the diagnosis of it. But it was her local school district preschool. It was very near her home. They knew a lot of people at the school. Um, she had, at that point, a nurse went to school with her, and then she also had an aide at school. And so all the aides in the program were ABA, so applied behavior analysis trained aides. So they really, really knew one-on-one behavioral interventions. And the classroom was set up like that. Each kid had their own workstation. So they were 3 and 4-year-olds, you guys. And they each, rather than big, they had some circle time where the class came together, but um, primarily they each worked individually, one-on-one with their ABA aides, and then the teacher coming around and working with them. She had, the ABA aide was learning sign language, but knew just the very basic. The parents were using C-sign at home, so signed exact English, and learning ASL as they went along. And Jet was not using a lot of sign at that time, but very responsive receptively to sign language. So I was there and I was observing for the day in her classroom and seeing different things. And one thing I was seeing was that it was very adult directed. And the tasks that she was being asked to do. And there wasn't she wasn't being given a lot of time, I didn't think, to process things. But then the real kicker was when we went to her speech and language teacher, which was in another part of the school and in another building. So we walk over there, she's using her walker, she gets over to the door, and they wanted her to use the word, they said, what do we need to do? The door was closed. And she didn't say anything, and she could say a few words, she was just starting to, but she signed open. So she signs open. And they said, what, Jet, what do we need to do? What do you want? And she signed open again. And they said, what? And she's getting more frustrated now. And she's lifting her hands off of her walker and leaning on her walker to sign open. And so she's trying so hard to communicate and say, I know what you want. I'm doing what you want. And they said, no, Jet, say open. And I said, she's saying open. She's telling you open. And they said, she needs to say it. And I had to bite my tongue, hold my clipboard really tight so I didn't just throw it on the ground. And we talked about it later on at the planning meeting with the team. And it was one of those clear things that everything was oriented on, that she had to fit into the program and do it the way that they wanted her to do it. And one of her goals for that week was to use the word open, but she had to verbally say it. So anyways, that was so this was right around the time Maurice and I were writing that article. So that's why she continues to be my inspiration for that. Because what I saw were a lot of good things in her program. There were a lot of structure and routine that were great, but there were some other things that just could have been improved. So I'm going to go through this next part kind of quickly because it's kind of the boring part of the presentation and you've got the slides. But one thing that's important is that we have to think about evidence-based practices. This is what state and federal governments in terms of educational practice want educators to do, and it's also the right thing to do. So it's really critical that we're thinking about, is there evidence, or do we know for sure that these practices help this particular learner, that the interventions as they're implemented are working well for this group, so they're well matched to the group. So there's a lot of evidence base for all of these different things, and these are all linked in the resources at the end on your slides. But there's a terrific ASD report this one's from 2015, but it was updated in 2020. There's a really interesting article that Christy Probst and Christina Borders wrote, thinking about characteristics between autism and deafblindness. There's a terrific sensory disabilities report that has a whole section on deafblindness that really, if you want to know more about evidence-based practices related to deafblindness. And then there's a great, and we have Sharon here at the presentation, so that's cool. The educational needs of children with Charge syndrome. So if you go to the Charge Foundation, there's some, again, some great resources there. In a nutshell, there are 27 established practices and interventions for individuals with deafblindness, and they fit under these 9 categories that we know there's enough evidence to say for sure these have positive outcomes and they do no harm. There are some things that there isn't enough evidence for, such as sensory integration therapy or sensory diets or gluten-free diets, things like that. So there just isn't sufficient evidence right now. But if you look at these particular areas, and that's what we're going to look at in a minute, is I'm going to suggest that we apply these different 9 areas to what we know about deaf-blind practices or good charge-related practices. My concerns about only thinking about autism focused interventions rather than deaf-blind as well is that a lot of intervention and instruction and part of the I'm going to make sure the other interpreter is ready. Okay. Part of the implementation and the fidelity of some of those practices is that children are responding to an adult demand or an adult direction. So it's very adult directed and initiated. There's a strong focus on behavioral model. There is some inflexibility with some of them, not all of them. And there is a focus on communication and reciprocal skills, but they're not thinking about children's multisensory needs. So you have to make sure, I mean, Jet needed an instructional aid that knew some good ASD interventions, but she also needed someone who could sign, who could be a language model for her that was providing her that access. You might have another child who has really limited, due to their colobomas, may have really limited use of their vision. So, but there's a lot of focus on using visual and auditory cues and supports in many of these interventions. So again, we can't provide an intervention that a child can't experience. And if they have insufficient vision and hearing to be able to use to get the information they need, then it shouldn't be something that we're thinking about. So, but there are some ASD interventions, and I'm going to talk about it in a second, that ABA ones particularly that could be good. Okay, so this is Christy Probst and Christina Borders talk about this, that what we know about the evidence base for ASD and deafblindness is that, well, basically we need more. There's not enough to say that we know an evidence-based practice for ASD will work for a child who's deafblind without doing modifications. So one way to go is that we have to think about modifying. We have to know that some of them are not going to be appropriate for a learner who's deafblind. Every intervention that we use with a child who's deafblind have to be individualized and matched to their needs. So that's why proper assessment is important. We have to consider sensory losses, and that when the assessment is done to identify the child's abilities or capabilities, that there should be an individual that's knowledgeable in deafblindness that's part of that assessment. So again, if you don't have someone in your district or on your team, then you need to contact your state deafblind project to get some support, and they might be able to match you up with someone nearby that could help you with that. Okay, I'm gonna take a sip of water. All right, so again, I'm gonna try to get on one slide what we could say a lot about that report on evidence-based practices for deafblindness is, it's probably 30 or 40 pages long, so there's a lot to say. But for people who are practitioners in our field or who have received training in deafblindness, I think you would all attest that these are areas that we continually are focusing on and thinking about. So first, communication and concept development, just because that's something that typically is delayed because of lack of incidental opportunities for incidental learning. Ensuring that they're functionally using their vision and appropriate assistive devices, that there's accommodations that are supporting auditory input, or you're providing another way for them to get that information, such as sign language, orientation and mobility, strategies that can help them to regulate their emotions and also just their sensory systems. So that need for either additional sensory input or breaks, age respectful, motivating curriculum, and then thinking about social relationships with other people, and then self-determination. So what I'm going to do in the subsequent rest of the talk is think about those 9 areas for ASD, and then these are 8 or 9 areas as well, and combine them. But first, what I want to do, I'm going to do a plug for Dr. Lily Slavin's checklist on educational needs of individuals with Charge syndrome. It's in your slideshow, the link below. It's also in the resources at the end. This is, and we don't have time to go into it, and I know Lily's done our 60-minute as well as 90-minute presentations on this. It's if you're working with a child who has Charge syndrome, if you're a parent of a child who has Charge syndrome, you should be sharing this, and you should be using this checklist tool. It is going to help them in terms of guiding them for what they need to be thinking about in every aspect of Charge syndrome, from the medical to the sensory to communication to academics to motor skills and things like that. So that's something I just wanted to make a plug for, because when I really think about what I want to do with combining ASD and deafblind practices, I think a lot of it is also well described in this checklist. So I'm going to check the chat one more time before we get into the final. Okay, we're all good. Okay. All right, we're all good. Okay, great. So this is what I suggest we do, is that we bridge those deafblind practices and those ASD practices. And we're first going to always look at the individual. We're going to select interventions that fit that individual, what their learning profile is, what skills they have, what support needs, accommodations. We're going to make sure that all the practices and approaches are child-led and are implemented in natural contexts. We're going to consider their sensory needs. So in terms of their sensory needs for access, support, and just what their preferences are in terms of sensory information that they're either seeking or avoiding. We're going to consult with specialists who can provide training and resources, and ideally someone who knows deafblindness, but ideally also knows Charge syndrome. And then we're going to provide families with accurate and complete information about ASD features and interventions. This one's really important. If we're going to tell families it's great that they've got that diagnosis now, great, they have that autism diagnosis now, well, now we can put them in this ASD program and use these interventions, make sure that they really understand what those interventions are and what those features are, okay? All right, so what you'll see in the top on each of the subsequent slides is the evidence-based practice for autism, and then what I'm going to put underneath all the bullet points are going to be things that are related to Charge-related practices that I'm suggesting. So individualized supports and services was one of the features in ASD. So the primary thing for individuals with Charge syndrome is follow the child. So, and we've all learned that from David Brown and from Jan van Dijk and Kathy Nelson and others. Following the child is going to ensure that the child's motivated and wants to engage, and also that you're respecting their preferences and thinking about ways that you can join them in the activities that they're doing and selecting and initiating. Child-guided practices following the child would have allowed the aide that day to have recognized that Jet was telling her open. She was telling her open using sign language because that's what Jet could do. And we're also going to think about with this in terms of individualizing services and supports is some kids aren't going to be able to do the whole activity, but that's fine. That shouldn't mean that someone else is going to do it for them or that they should be excluded from it. We're going to think about how they can partially participate. So we're going to make sure that kids, as much as possible, are having successes rather than failures, because that's what's going to move them forward in terms of learning. Systematic instruction is another highly uh, uh, studied and rigorous evidence base for autism. And what's important to think about here is that's why a lot of children who are deaf, blind, or have charge syndrome really need things to be directly taught to them because of what they are not able to access incidentally in terms of vision and hearing information. So they need repeated practices. They have to directly be experiencing that. This little girl here in this slide, we're not just going to show her a picture about how plants grow, but we're going to teach her how to plant a flower and how to water it, and that soil needs to be there. And we're going to take her out into the garden and let her feel the sun and know that the plant needs to feel that heat thing too. We're going to model steps in a task or activity for them and break things down. And then we're going to use materials and routines and activities that are present in the child's home and classroom so that they can really make this concrete, meaningful reference point. They need things to slow down, be broken down into parts, and then they get really, really skilled and good at doing things. Pacing and practice is another thing that we're going to do to individualize things. So oftentimes these children need more time to take in information and learn new things. We have to plan those transitions really well and prompt them and alert them if it's going to be different or when the change is coming up. And then we don't want to rush. We want to go at their own pace. And then using a real activity-based curriculum. So that's going to allow them for movement breaks or different positions. So we're going to be flexible and adaptable, not say that because you're in, like perhaps in an autism class, all the children have to sit at their desks in particular ways or use materials in particular ways or do things in a certain order. That may not work for a child with charge. So that's the reason that there needs to be a real thorough assessment and understanding of who this child is, and then developing the curriculum and program around that. Environmental adaptation. So this is something that usually is really great in autism settings, that they are usually very organized spaces, and the practices they use can be really helpful. But I think they also have to be really mindful about the child's sensory losses and making sure that they're making adaptations for that. So organized learning spaces, a calendar system for a lot of these kids. They can't see that calendar that's up on the board that everyone else is following. They need their own individual one that they can touch and feel and interact with. Thinking about having materials that are there that are of high interest, but and that are going to enhance motivation and interest, but also things that they're familiar with. Thinking about presenting information in a variety of modes, thinking about auditory and visual clutter and lighting, lots of different thoughts about, variety of seating, and then a safe space for the child to relax and recharge. So they need that recharging station, many of these kids. This is actually a photograph of that same girl, Jet. When she was in the preschool program, she could engage in activities for about 20 minutes, and then she really needed to go check out. And she needed like 5-10 minutes on a beanbag, covered in a blanket, getting some good proprioceptive input, and then she was ready to come back. So, oh yeah, I know what I want to show you here. This was shared with me during the pandemic. So this is a young man, he's in high school, and look at how he's got all set up at home. So obviously, if he was at school, he'd be wearing a shirt, but he's set up at home, so he doesn't have to wear a shirt. It was hot that day. But look at, he's got his screen set up. He's got his keyboard color coded set up. He's really close. He's got his cochlear in, so he's ready. He's ready for school. And I don't know if you're noticing anything else. I'm going to show you it from a slightly different angle, just to show you a little bit about how creative this young man is. And his mom said we could share these photos and this story because she was so proud of him when she noticed what he did to make sure he was really ready to learn and pay attention in class. He took the screen off the air conditioning vent. He pulled it off and figured out his toes could fit right down inside there. So now he's really well supported. He knows that he's going to be fine sitting in this chair and listening to his lesson. So that's what I mean about these kids being so intelligent and creative. And instead of being like, no, that's not what we do with the air conditioning vent. That's not what we do. his mom instead applauded him and said, isn't this great? Look what he figured out on his own. So I had to share that. Um, Again, the comprehensible structured learning environments is part of autism classes, but we really need to think about this in terms of with individuals with charge, how you have to plan it differently, how consistency and predictability is so important because it reduces stress and anxiety. It also allows children to be able to initiate and be more independent because they know what to expect, so they learn the routine and then they can take it the next step. And then thinking about making sure that you've got some kind of calendar system schedules and then letting children know about any changes in advance because we want to make sure that we can decrease the chance that they might get upset or have a meltdown. And then meaningful curriculum, again, specialized curriculum at ASD is very focused on communication, on social things. So we need to think about that too with charge students, but we also want to make sure that we're never underestimating these kids. So many of these kids have typical intelligence for children their age. So we shouldn't be thinking that they don't just because they may not be expressing it yet. Thinking about those functional lessons and activities that will be useful in later life. So always think about what we're teaching in class. How is that going to also help them outside of school? How is that going to help them as an adult? The focus on communication, often for children with charge, you want to have a total communication approach. So if they have some hearing or they're aided spoken language, but also some visual language and tactile input. And then thinking about, can we alternate between seated activities and those that require movement so that students can, a lot of these kids need to move, they need that activity. And it's their internal body telling them they need that. It's not them being naughty or bad. So let me take a sip of water, please. We're getting there. I really appreciate everybody hanging in there for 90 minutes. It's a long time for a presentation. So applied behavior analysis. Someone asked this question earlier. And there are some applied behavior analysis approaches that I think can be helpful for charge. There's some like the Denver model or some that are very much more focused on care provider, parent doing turn taking and following the child's lead. So that would be the one thing I would say with applied behavior analysis is make sure that it's something that's a more child-centered approach to it. But there's also Tim Hartshorn especially has really pointed out some things that we need to think about in terms of charge when we think about ABA. So first we have to think about that impact of the multisensory issues or on their behavior. And then there's etiology specific behaviors. So charge syndrome has specific behaviors. And we already talked about it. They look like autism, but that doesn't mean that they are autism. It can be more difficult to identify what the exact function of a behavior is. So a functional approach to behavior, you want to do your ABC data. So what was the antecedent? What's the behavior? What's the consequence? For children with charge, there could be a lot of different antecedents that might not be apparent. The child could be in pain. They could be experiencing a lot of stress and anxiety. It could be related to their proprioceptive and vestibular functions. So, and those might not be evidence. So someone might think that the antecedent was just that I asked them to, get in line to go out to recess and they dropped to the floor. But maybe it wasn't that. Maybe it was one of these other things. Their communicative intent may be the result of an unmet need. So every behavior is communication. So the reason you might be seeing the message that they're sending is because it's an unmet need. Now that could be a sensory unmet need, or it could be something external, like because they're trying to engage and interact with you. David Brown reminds us that we should be looking at these behaviors as creative adaptations. If they're lying down to read a book, it's because they figured out that I need to be lying down to be able to use my vision that way. Another story David's told me is this young girl he knew with charge syndrome that would just, when she got up and left the classroom, she just made a beeline straight to the cafeteria and she just go, and she couldn't stop. And if she stopped, she'd fall to the ground. And that was a problem for the team until David pointed out, like, well, how well can she see when she's not moving? And what they noticed is that there were certain markers along the way on the route. And she knew how to spot every one of them with her limited vision. And she'd looked at those things. And as long as she was looking at them, that visual fixation and focus allowed her to keep her balance and she would just get going. But if someone asked her to stop and she lost focus on that visual marker, then she would just sit down. So really think about if there's a reason that children are doing these things, and then replacement behaviors have to be taught and practiced in natural context. So I want to show you a video in a second of this little girl who I know out here in California, and her parents said I could share this, but it points out to me the need for sensory breaks that a lot of these kids need too. Many kids with charge, because of their inefficient sensory processing, it's really exhausting 24/7 to like have those limitations or those difficulties with all of your senses can really be tiring. So there's a necessity that they have for different sensory breaks, and the breaks look different for each kid. Some kids might just want to lay down and go to sleep. Other kids might want to bury themselves under a heavy blanket. Some kids want to move and spin around and flap their hands or rock back and forth. So really thinking about what the child's doing and is it giving them the chance to calm down, refocus, reduce that stress and anxiety. So you have to be able to read the child well. So this could be another reason why it's important that the person that's working with the child knows deafblindness, understands charge syndrome. So here is my friend Mackenzie. I'll give you a quick context. She was at a birthday party at a park in San Francisco. It's a pretty hot day, and there was a lot of stuff going on. She had been playing over on the playground. There were some games the kids were all playing. A lot of people were talking to her because they hadn't seen her in a while. So she was getting a lot of social interaction. And I was sitting down talking to her parents when this occurred. So she goes over to those foldable chairs that you bring to parks or soccer games. And she's going to put her hands into the place where the beverage holder is. And she's going to put her head right down into the base of the seat. And she's going to get her knees up and she's going to start to rock and bounce. So she's bouncing her butt really hard down on her feet. Her head's buried deep in the seat. She's wiggling her hands a little bit. And I was fascinated, like looking at her doing, because she had just been interacting with everyone. So she does that. You saw she just did it for 20 seconds. She got up, and a few minutes later, she walked over to the dad of the little boy who was having the party, who was blowing up balloons and making balloon animals. And look at her. Look how completely focused she is. She's able to interact with him. She has her arms on his hand. He's smiling, asking her what animal she wants. She's looking and smiling at him. She's now able to socialize, use her vision, communicate back, all because she herself knew she needed that break, and nobody stopped her from doing that rocking. But I will bet you anybody walking by the park that knows autism or thinks they know autism or has heard of autism saw her rocking in their chair and thought, well, that's kind of weird. I wonder if she has autism. So, wait, what's going on here? Okay. And then we're getting there. We're getting close to the end. Charge, just relationships. So as I said at the very beginning, what I see with people with charge is that there's a lot of social interest and a real desire to have relationships with other people. So what's important is that they have the supports to develop those types of things. So many times that's going to mean that they need a trusted intervener or an aide that's working with them that really can read them and help them to develop the social and communicative skills they need, but also make sure the peers are informed and understand how to provide encouraging coaching and support to a person. Engaging together in joint activities and materials, all those things that are going to help them build their self-confidence, and so that they are then going to develop this positive self-image, which is what all kids need for them to develop positive peer relationships. They feel good about themselves, and I think, oh, I want to get to know that kid. They look like fun, or that person also, likes to play wall ball and throw the ball against the wall, or that girl looks like she likes to color too. So thinking about that, really important to be focused on that. But what I'll say in terms of social supports that's unique with deaf blindness and charge is it oftentimes in the beginning really needs a supportive person, an adult that's helping to coach and encourage those things to happen. So I'm just going to go back to my just review that bridging again of these practices is looking at that individual child and developing the program based on their needs, not on what the program says the child should be. And then using child-led, not adult-led practices, thinking about sensory needs. So just in terms of how they're getting information, so access, what supports they're using, and then what are their preferences. So that really goes back to thinking about those sensory breaks, consulting with deafblind specialists, and then making sure families, if you're recommending ASD interventions, that they really understand that intervention. And you've talked to them about that and they know what that's going to mean. I'm going to check my chat one more time because I see quite a bit's come in. Projects we can work on with our children at home, creative enough to keep them in it. Well, I would say Cinquette, I hope I'm saying that right, is I would follow again. What it differs. What is the child like? So I've known some kids that love artwork. That little girl that I showed you that was rocking in the chair, she is a builder. I think she's going to be an engineer someday. So maybe it's going to be Legos or building blocks. For other kids, it might be me. I've known kids that just love music. I've known kids that do a lot of cool things with iPads. So it's hard to say. But if you want to contact me later, we could talk more. Be sure to use functional vision and functional hearing data to make sure they can access. Thank you for that reminder, Wendy. And know where, yes, great. Functional analysis in addition to FBA can tweak sensory, good. Jennifer, thank you. What approach should be used when a child with charge is very demanding helper and has a hard time communicating that she wanted help? It results in, all right, so Jillian, this is so interesting. So my friend Jet, that cute little girl I showed you, or who's right here, oh my gosh, when she was younger, you couldn't even say the word help. If you said the word help, she melted into a puddle. She would be so upset. Oops, sorry, I hit my slides. So I think, but she doesn't do that anymore. So I think it's, yeah, what maybe you want to try is maybe doing the activity next to the child, like parallel, and kind of do your own thing, and then they could see what the next step is. You might also teach her just, I don't know if she would just do the sign help, or if you could have just, or a cue card, something that she holds up, something that's maybe simpler. So maybe it's just so you have to tweak out, is it that she can't communicate the need for help, or is it that she's kind of mad at herself that she's having to ask for help? So that with my friend Jet, that was it. She wanted to be able to do it on her own. She got really upset if she made a mistake. She'd rip things up. So, and I've heard that about other kids with charge, that they can kind of be what someone mentioned earlier, that idea of being a perfectionist, and that we have to see that as a bad thing versus it just does actually probably have a lot to do with our sensory system. So I'm kind of just talking now, Julian. I don't know if that helps, but I would be happy to talk more. What's the best way to identify or get a diagnosis of charge? My apologies if this question. So Colette, I would tell you to go to the Charge Foundation page, and there are ways to get information there. Meg Hefner is also, I don't know if you're on the Charge Facebook group, but oftentimes these kind of questions get asked. Meg Hefner is a good person, and you could find her contact probably on the Charge Foundation page. But you can also reach out to me later. Karen's been an intervener for 10 years, 8 with it. Oh, lucky you, working with a child with charge. I've been amazed and intrigued by him. He's been a successful student. I'm so glad I had deafblind training. Yay. It really helps connect the dots. We've informed Karen, lucky you, and lucky, that's a really lucky student. Will we have access to print these slides? Pam, I will put it back in the chat again, the link. Here's the link to the slides, and so you can download and print them yourself.
I did that, Julie. We're good.
Okay.
Yep.
Oh yeah, you did. My kiddo, so my daughter loves reading, counting, yeah. Draws, yeah. when they missed out. Oh, they missed out on helping. Okay. So yeah, a lot of that I think is just that's trial and error. You're just gonna have to think about that's gonna upset this child if that happens. And so make sure that they're involved from the beginning to the middle to the end. Um, okay. And now it looks like the other, you're welcome. And now it looks like the other questions are about the, so there's a resource page here in the slideshow with links. Um, this will take you to our California Deafblind Pages newsletter webpage. And as I told you, we're updating all the links. So I think something from 2014 might not be updated. So maybe wait till the end of the week, but I asked someone to make sure that one gets updated. Um, there's some great charge webcasts if you don't know about them from Perkins, their e-learning program. They're fantastic. And then there's the educational checklist, and there's all the evidence-based stuff if you're somebody that likes that, and then references, and then that's how you can contact me. And I'm going to stop my share and tell you how much I enjoyed this. And thank you again for listening to me talk.